Good morning. I know when they say Kerri Hoffman and I bring a whole party with me for this conversation. My name is Kerri Hoffman and I'm the CEO of PRX. We distribute public radio and podcasts all around the country. And I just want to say thank you to GBH for what looks like an amazing 2-day conversation that kicked off last night, of course. And I also wanted to take a minute to thank the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, whose philanthropic support made this panel possible. So, a little scene setting for you. At a time when our communities feel increasingly fragmented across lines of faith, politics, ethnicity, and identity, this conversation couldn't be more timely or more necessary. Today, we're exploring the power of storytelling and media to build bridges, deepen empathy, and create shared understanding. When we tell stories, we know this really well in our field of work, but when we tell stories, we are exploring the contextual way that they work, which means that they're grounded in real experiences. And we don't just inform, we connect, we humanize, and we lay the groundwork for collaboration in a world that feels so divided. We're fortunate to be joined by some truly extraordinary group of panelists, leaders who are doing the work every day to strengthen democracy and foster cooperation across differences. Our moderator is Ann Kerri, an award-winning journalist whose commitment to truth, empathy, and global storytelling has shaped the way we see the world, and we understand the world. And joining her is Amy Spitalnick, CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, bringing deep insight into coalition building and combating hate. Maya Berry, Executive Director of the Arab American Institute, a tireless advocate for civic engagement and human rights. Timothy Head, President and CEO of Unify US, whose work centers on bridging divides and healing our civic fabric. I knew when I wrote that civic fabric was going to be tricky, and sure enough it was. For 10 years, he was also the executive director of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. And a partner of ours, David DeSteno, professor of psychology at Northeastern University and author of the book and host of the podcast, How God Works, whose research illuminates how our spiritual lives can support compassion and cooperation. This is not just a panel, it's a conversation that's rooted in hope, courage, and the belief that connection across lines of faith can be a force for good in the world. So with that, we're going to kick things off with some active listening. It's kind of where it all starts. This is a clip that you will hear from the podcast, How God Works. And after this, we will leave you in the very capable hands of Ann Kerri. So thank you very much. And just because this is a small group, let's have a little warm round of applause for our panelists, since they don't get it when they walk up. Thank you so much.
Anger, stress, isolation, despair. Over the past decade, they've all been on the rise in the U.S. Last year on the show, we talked about how this trend is affecting young adults. But it isn't only young adults whose well-being has taken a nosedive. Something deeper is going on, and it's tearing at the fabric of the United States. We're talking past each other, seeing enemies where we should be seeing partners. And as a nation, we're feeling alone and hopeless at record levels. If things keep going in this direction, we risk leaving an irreparable hole in our private, public, and even political life. How did we get here? And how do we fix it? While there's no one easy answer to either of those questions, I think spirituality plays a role in both. For thousands of years, it's helped us look inward and find kindness, connection, meaning, and joy, all things that have been on the decline and that we could use more of to tackle the problems we're facing today. So, what's the way forward? On today's episode, we'll talk with Krista Tippett, host of the podcast On Being, about America's changing spiritual landscape and how she thinks we can regain our footing for the path ahead.
Even if religion is never going to come back with the strength or with the influence that it had until not very long ago, we actually have to recover that capacity for having some kind of shared moral vocabulary.
And with Senator Chris Murphy about why he thinks the United States is facing a spiritual crisis, what role politics might play, and how politicians right and left can focus on policies that might start to heal the challenges and divides that plague us.
I'm supposed to set the rules of society as a United States Senator so that people have easier access to fulfillment, contentment, happiness, and less people are reporting that they feel those things. So I, as a policymaker, have to dive deep and figure out, why are people feeling that way?
I'm Dave DeSteno, and this is How God Works.
Well, we appreciate that clip and welcome our panel again. And welcome to you, and thank you for being here, Amy and Maya and Tim and David. And already we know you are brave, because most people would run if they're invited to an interfaith conversation about the religious divide. And yet you are here, so thank you. So why are you here? What moved you, Tim, to be here?
Probably lobster rolls, for starters.
I don't think there were any promised, but maybe.
I live in Atlanta, Georgia, so also a respite from some heat. I think that for me, so after 10 years of working in the political space at that intersection of faith and politics, the Faith and Freedom Coalition, I've had plenty of tomatoes thrown at me in a ton of different settings, sometimes in red rooms and sometimes in blue rooms, by the way. Ironically, probably more in red rooms. So I think that what I find is virtual is fine, but in person is powerful. And my hope in a setting like this, both literally on this stage, but also through the next couple days, is to both listen and be heard, because I think that that's really one of the cores of this in a large, complicated, fast-moving world. We don't really spend much time with each other to both hear and be heard.
And be heard is really the key words, I think, that we're going to be talking about. But we need to point out that rarely in recent memory has faith been so at the forefront as it is today. And one of the major reasons, and we need to address it, is the war in Gaza and the attack by Hamas. And Maya, you have been a close observer of all of this and the fallout, which has caused, it seems, a deep despair among many. And I wonder, because there are journalists in the room, what grade you would give American journalists in their coverage of the war and also the student protests as well. What are your thoughts and experiences looking at that? I know it's a big question. If you want, I'll keep talking while you think of your answer, and because you deserve time to think about that.
It's a good question I've thought a lot about. And for those who don't know me, I tend to be direct, so I'm happy to lean into that as I answer that. I think we're at a time in our country with a variety of failing democratic institutions, small d democratic institutions. And regrettably, I would say that the media is among them. For some of the reasons that we heard in this morning's opening plenary, for sure. And I'm not dismissing, I think, the challenges that are posed at this time for media outlets, especially local media outlets, just so incredibly important. But on this issue in particular, I regrettably would say that we are failing. We're failing to tell the story of two people equally harmed by violence. Part of the challenge, I think, is understanding that the dehumanization of Arabs, specifically the dehumanization of Palestinians, and dare I say, as my opening remarks on a panel about faith, the conflation of faith and ethnicity, and not understanding that this particular conflict is actually not a religious one. So it's challenging in that regard. The one example I would give for people to sort of reflect on that are journalists in the room is to sort of think about very unfortunate statement that was made immediately after the horrific attack of October 7th by the Israeli Prime Minister, who referred to the children of light and the children of darkness. And he tweeted it officially from the government account, later deleted, because it's just not a good look. Not because that's not how things are framed. And that's sort of a government position, right? Then if you think about our coverage of Israeli children as victims, because they are, our coverage of Israeli children as children, but what if we called Palestinian children? Do we call them Palestinian children? How many outlets refer to Palestinian children as people under the age of 18? How many outlets talk about Palestinian children as teenagers or minors? Even their ability to simply be children is part of the way that I think we have to talk about how the media covers this issue. I can say a lot more, but I'll stop there and just appreciate that we're opening up with that.
And so, Amy, let me ask you, because at least some of the disparities, I think, are self-evident. I think most people would agree are self-evident. So I wonder how you are thinking about this, especially after hearing her, and also if you might also add in your answer what your perspective might be about how many, including people in power, are using the accusation of anti-Semitism.
Well, look, this is all deeply interconnected. Maya talked about the sort of zero-sum approach that is so often colors coverage of Israel and Gaza and the Middle East more broadly. And the reality is that the only path forward there is one in which the humanity and dignity of both people are recognized. And that's true in terms of the actual path towards a solution there, but it's also true in terms of how we understand it here and how it shapes and informs American policy. And that same zero-sum false binary dynamic that colors coverage of the Middle East is also applied to how we think about its repercussions and ripple effects here at home. We saw immediately on October 7th efforts to pit the Jewish community against the Palestinian, Arab American, and Muslim American communities to turn this into some big religious or ethnic war, when in fact we know that the safety of the Jewish community is inextricably linked with the safety of Arab and Muslim Americans and with each and every other community. And so we can do both things at the same time. We can be clear-eyed that what happened on October 7th was horrific and devastating to the Jewish community, the deadliest day for our people since the Holocaust. We can be clear-eyed that there are hostages that remain in horrific conditions, and we can be horrified by the death of thousands and thousands of Palestinians and the conditions in which they are living before October 7th and after. And so too can we see the humanity of both communities here, be clear-eyed about the very real anti-Semitism that exists. The reports that came out from Harvard, for example, this week underscores that Jewish students, faculty, and many others are feeling real fear and discrimination. Another parallel report also underscored the fact that Arab American and Muslim American students were also feeling a lot of fear.
In other words, tell the truth.
Exactly.
And
the ways in which we are now seeing the federal government exploit legitimate, real concerns about anti-Semitism to go after core democratic norms and values, our academic institutions, is just not aligned with the reality of what the vast majority of the Jewish community actually wants. We were proud to lead a statement from JCPA a few weeks ago that brought together 3 of the 4 major denominations and a number of other mainstream organizations saying these two things are true at the same time. Anti-Semitism is real and must be confronted, and it should not be exploited to undermine our democracy, our academic institutions, and our core rights. And that complexity is where I think the majority of Jews are. A poll came out last week underscoring that 71% of Jews had concerns with the administration's approach to how it's handling anti-Semitism. And so how we bring that complexity and nuance to how these issues are covered and how we talk about them more broadly is so important, because it's actually where the people most impacted by this are on the issues.
Maya, you talked about dehumanization. So David, let's talk about that, because you are a professor of psychology. You're a good voice on perhaps how we should think about the language, not just by people in power, but in social media and in our streets now. But there is, as an example, maybe I don't need to give an example, but there was a recent example from on high when the word Palestinian was publicly used as a slur against Chuck Schumer, who is, America's highest-ranking Jewish leader, to say that he's not Jewish anymore. So, what is your perspective on what is happening, and what are we going to do about it?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I want to start by making a point about how journalists think about and write about religion. Because typically, journalists treat it, not all, but many journalists treat it in one of two ways. And the first is as a label, right? It's a way that we can sort people into what we believe are homogenous groups, even though they're not. And that we assume those groups have some self-interest motivating them. And we do this with race and with ethnicity and with SES. The second way, that's a little better but still problematic, is we sort people into these groups and we assume that, yes, they may have some self-interest, but they have deeply held beliefs and convictions that go beyond self-interest about what is right and wrong, what is acceptable and not in the world. But both of those miss an important part of religion, which is religion isn't just about a label you use or a set of beliefs. It's about what you do. Religion is better thought of as a technology. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but what I mean by that is all of these faiths in ways that you can define groups to have something else that other groups don't really have, which are they have a set of practices, the reading of sacred texts, rituals and rites that help people meet challenges of life. And what we know from science is that these are profound ways to move hearts and minds. Whether they do it for good or for ill depends upon the goals of those using it. And as you've heard here, most wars aren't fought about religion. There are some, but they're few. But religion gets caught up in them. And I think it's important when journalists try to explain what's going on that they give insight to people that religion is a way to nudge our minds and bodies. It's not just a label. It can help explain things that seem rather contradictory or that people don't understand if you're outside of the faith. So one quick example. Everybody here is affiliated with one of the Abrahamic faiths that at their core emphasizes love and mercy and forgiveness. How do faiths that emphasize this, how are they also used to justify violence and war and harm against each other? And one thing we know from the scientific literature is that our conceptions of God, what we think God is, what we think God wants, are malleable. When you feel that your way of life is under threat, people's conceptions of God become more aggressive, more punitive. They view God as valuing vengeance, right? And so when Prime Minister Netanyahu will say, the children of light against the children of the dark, or he brings up the point about the passage of the Amalekites and how God wants us, it's justifiable to extinguish other people. Or when we see it with Christian nationalism, if you go to these events, you will see pictures of Jesus with AK-47s. The Bible is a book of many voices like most texts are. Which ones you resonate with, which ones you accept are a function of the threat you're feeling. And so suddenly if you see God as more punitive, and there's lots of data that show those conceptions change in times of stress, then all the normal rules about love and compassion, it's easy for them to fall to the wayside. And faiths that are built on love and compassion can be seen to justify violence in ways that I think most of us find troubling. There's a good side to it too, which I hope we'll get to, but it's my call to kind of understand that religion isn't just a label. It is a process for a lot of people.
All right, well, I hope we get to it too. We've got so much to talk about, but we'll try. Some data points that are important to mention. According to a brand new, just released in February, Pew survey, Christians are the majority at 6 in 10 Americans, though the number has dropped 16 points since 2007. And the largest single group of American Christians, 40%, are Protestant. Now, Tim, I'm wondering, because you've worked to try to bridge the divides among people in that group, including among evangelicals, and in that bridging, you've been able to, they've been able to become a major force in the last election. So I wonder what strategies really worked to get people to the same table, and because you've done the process there to get people who are divided to become what they've become.
Well, how much time you got? So I have two daughters, one 17, one 12, turns 13 in the, so I'll go ahead and call her 13. She would be offended if I didn't call her a teenager now. But I tell them whenever they're heading off to school at the beginning of the year that we tend to find what we're looking for. That if we're looking for people that we agree with, we tend to find that if we're looking for people that we disagree with, we can find those too. And so, and by the way, within an individual person, I can also find that which I agree with her or him about, and also that I disagree with her or him about. And so, one of the kind of secrets in running campaigns and politics in general is I think a lot of people think of politics as an exercise in persuasion. It's actually like just the raw political kind of winning and losing campaigns is actually an exercise in identification. And then, so identifying people and then how to cast a broad enough net that you are identifying commonalities. If you are running a campaign that has a narrow scope, you're going to be frustrated for most of your political career. And so there's kind of this Goldilocks exercise of common enough that we can win and exclusive enough that there's momentum and energy.
Finding commonality.
But commonality is really the secret.
And you're also then creating a clear sort of almost vision of what could happen if there is a collaboration. Am I getting this?
Correct.
You're communicating.
You're communicating that, and then look. I mean, this is age old. This is not American. This is not 2025. People tend to unite more around what they are opposed to than what they agree about, and so one of the sort of tactics. This is at least 2,500 years old. Is identifying commonality based on a shared opponent. And so one of the challenges I would argue right now is because what is politically at stake is so large or so powerful that you're never not running for office, either as a president, as a member of Congress, if we're talking about on the political side. And so people never kind of like empty the chambers and put their guns down, because as soon as I'm elected on November the 5th, on November the 6th, I go to dinner with my family, and November the 7th, I'm running again. And
so in this movement, I'm going to ask a follow-up question because it sort of is begging it. This now majority and also religious and religiously a powerful religious group, which has been said, I don't know if you agree with this, but has been said is leaning towards Christian nationalism. How does it fit in your mind? Does it include still America's promise of plurality?
Good question, and I would say the answer is yes. And I would say that the other kind of interesting, I've had a lot of conversations about even that sort of typology of kind of leaning towards Christian nationalism. Like even the framing of questions like that or discussions like that they tend to kind of erect barriers instead of erode barriers. And so I think one of the other kind of delicate things is trying to bring the benefit of the doubt. So I try to, not just in political context and legislative context, but in social context, not only ask what do people believe, but why do they believe what they believe? And usually, if you can get yourself to ask that question, it also starts to kind of, one, humanize the other person or the group, and two, at least build an appreciation, if not an agreement, with what they're doing. So
how we speak to each other, exactly. But did you answer the question about pluralism?
So I think that there is the pluralism I find is not so much like in a media. I live in Metro Atlanta, which is one of the more heterogenic, portions of the country right now. There actually is probably more acceptance or tolerance for other communities within Atlanta than there are between Georgians and Californians. So the otherness tends to be more geographic in my experience than ideological. So it's framed as ideological, but if I'm sitting in a room with you and I disagree, there's a better chance that we're going to at least find some elements of agreement. So your question about plurality, I would argue, is less about, it's more about distance than about, and kind of familiarity
I see.
than true.
So there's a
ideology.
vulnerability if we don't get in the room together, is what I think I'm hearing you say.
Absolutely, which is why it's so harmful when people just either have a relationship and end it over ideological questions, or never engage a relationship because of presumed distinctions or differences.
And engage and listen is kind of part of it. It must be said, Maya and Amy, you've found a way of working together, and you don't agree on everything. This is an important thing for us to think about. We're going to get in the room, but we're not going to always agree. So how do we work together when we don't always agree so that we have these common goals? I think we just heard from Tim a sense about what has happened that he's been able to make work. How about the two of you? You two want to just jump in this together? Sure.
Yeah, this is not the first time Maya and I have sat next to each other and had these conversations. It's been, I think, over the last year and a half. Everyone always likes to say, "Oh, like, you're so brave for doing this." And I said, like, no, this is actually the only way we're going to be able to do the work that we need to do. We sit on so many boards and roundtables together. We're both on the leadership conference board together. We're part of this demand diversity roundtable. Everything that is at stake right now in terms of our community's safety, in terms of our democracy, requires us to figure out ways to sit down together and actually find a path forward. And also, I don't think we're that far apart on many things. We might have specific policy disagreements, but I think even more than policy disagreements, what's come out in the conversations we've had together is that our communities are not even speaking the same language. And that is where a lot of this tension derives from. And I think particularly from a media perspective, this is important. When you hear terms like Zionism, it means one thing to one person and something else to another person. For me, Zionism is just simply the belief that there should be a Jewish homeland somewhere in this part of the world where the Jewish community has historical connections. And it actually goes hand in hand with my belief in Palestinian self-determination, humanity, and dignity. But if you ask someone, whether it's the Netanyahu government or maybe a campus protester, they'll have an entirely different understanding of what that term means for, in some ways, very legitimate reasons because of how these conversations have played out and the zero-sum approach I was talking about earlier. And so if we're going to actually figure out a path forward here, it's one that needs to recognize that even if as we hear these terms, I'm hearing them in a way that might be entirely different than Maya's hearing them, or that someone else in our community might be hearing them. And that at least opens the door to the sorts of conversations and partnerships that are so existential right now.
Yeah, so I would start with literally we agree on the majority of things, like period, full stop. So it's sort of, in some ways, it's challenging when I hear people talking about how do you work across cross divides? And I'm like, what's the divide here? So 100% what Amy just said about language is spot on. You and I have talked about Zionism, we've talked about Intifada, we've talked about a variety of things. They land completely differently for me and my community. And I'm happy to share with you what they mean to me and my community. And the reason I say that is that there's a power differential we also need to talk about here. When the qualifiers are inserted in media coverage on this issue, it is not that we're trying to draw the distinction between, say, political Zionism and cultural Zionism. That doesn't happen. We just talk about it in a way that represents one particular viewpoint. And I would suggest I don't place that particular viewpoint with the American Jewish community or Christian Zionists alone. I talk about it in the context of American foreign policy objectives and how they get placed and layered into this conversation. So it's one of those things where we have to be honest about how this sort of plays out. And I appreciate your point about pluralistic societies. I'd love to talk with you more about that. And when you say data points, if I may, a public service announcement. The majority of Arab Americans in this country, because remember, we're Americans, we're having a domestic conversation. I really want to talk about foreign policy all the time. I'm an immigrant to this country as a product of foreign policy. My family came here after the war broke out in Lebanon. Love to talk foreign policy. But we're having a conversation about American communities. The majority of Arab Americans are Christian. A plurality of the American Muslim community has historically been Black. The single largest segment of the American Muslim community that's growing in this country is actually Latino. So when the New York Times covers the report that Amy just referenced with regards to Harvard, they issued 2 reports. I have not yet them read. I will have a lot to say when I do, but I haven't yet. But when the New York Times covers that, they say, Harvard issued a report about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, quote unquote. Islamophobia is not a term I will use, and I want to be clear on this point as well. I am personally Muslim. I'm also an immigrant, which makes me an outlier in the Arab American community. I care deeply about my faith. It's actually why I do my work. When you talk about these issues, I come to this work because of my faith. But it's really important that we understand the conflation and the way that it plays out is also about canceling and erasing Arab Americans as an ethnicity. I can't talk about anti-Arab racism if folks don't acknowledge Arab Americans exist. Harvard did not call their report a report about Islamophobia, but the New York Times did. So what's up, guys? I can't talk about these issues if they're not raised. The second erasure that happens is the erasure of the American Muslim community here. If a plurality are Black and a growing Latino population, why are you talking about Arab American immigrants like me? There's just a deep disconnect from the reality that exists here. Some of it because of a lack of a knowledge, and some of it because it's politically easier to talk about Muslims and Jews and then read to get along better, because that doesn't force us to have a conversation about the occupation of Palestinian land. So I would challenge us as we think about interreligious understanding that there's an agenda that comes into play when we do it that way.
Really interesting points about the binary kind of okay, we have, I don't want to step on that, but the treatment of stories in a binary manner, but also what you talked about regarding language and how language itself can be the separator. So this is to speak around the language, speak about the words you're trying to express versus using those quick and easy and not communicatively, not necessarily saying the same thing to everyone kind of words. I mean, ultimately, what I'm hearing from everyone is really the need for empathy. We're all here because there is and thinking about this and struggling to understand and even cover it is because we are talking about something so deeply intimate, and yet it is also so politically charged. And the need for empathy is I think, connects it all. And David, this is something you understand. You wrote a book on trust, and ultimately that's what we want to be able to do, to feel that we can trust that you will be kind to me and hear as I suffer and pay attention and care for me. How do we get it?
It's a good question. I think the first thing to realize, and a point that I make to a lot of my scientific colleagues, is that religions have existed for millennia. We've been here for a few hundred years, we scientists. And throughout those millennia, yes, there have been wars, but some of the most profound movements to find peace and care and empathy have come from religion. The point I make in modern history is look at the civil rights movement. Most of the people who led that were deep people of faith, many from the Black church, but other areas as well. And so, you can have issues like J.D. Vance debating recently departed Pope Francis about who we should care about and why we shouldn't care about illegal immigrants as much as our own families and people. But if you read the sacred texts, whether it's the Torah, the Quran, New Testament, and Christianity, they talk a lot more about loving the stranger in your land than your own people. So the question is, how do we do that, right? And it's here, I think, we have to return to the wisdom of the scriptures, to cultivate, if you're a Buddhist, loving kindness. In Judaism, it's Gemilut Hasidim. In Christianity and Islam, it's similar practices. What we know is that when you engage with your faith deeply, those of you who may have done the contemplative exercise this morning, we know from my lab and others, right, engaging in those types of practices demonstrably increase empathy. Anything that you can do to deeply imagine and put yourself in the place of others, or to imagine expanding the scope of your moral circle, whose pain is worthy to feel, will make you feel more empathy, right? Because your brain basically says, whose pain should I care about? Typically, from an evolutionary sense, you care about those who are closer to you, who is on your team, because they're the ones who are going to pay you back. But all the talk of caring for the stranger and expanding that moral circle, you can retrain your mind to do it. And it works best, as you were saying, when you're physically co-present with other people. We had somebody on my show who runs this course in Jerusalem where he brings together young Palestinians, and this was before the tragic events of October 7th, and young Israelis. And they sing together before they talk about anything. And after that singing together, that bringing them into union and communion with each other, that song does, suddenly discussions open up. And they can take those perspectives of other people. And so again, my mantra of thinking about religion as what you do, not just what you believe, there's a wisdom in those traditions. And if we pursue those, it actually can build empathy.
And I feel a need to speak to those who are not affiliated with a major religion, because America is a nation that's affected by many different religions, including 29% of Americans who even though they're not affiliated, many of them have spiritual lives that are deep, that are influenced, and have contributed and done great things, compassionate things in the world. So we want to, I think, also mention that as well. So, but you know, you were talking about training your mind, right? And we hear from Maya and Amy, you know, we're hearing about collaboration, but we need to also speak about those who are on the extremes of these ideas, and for whom it is anti-Semitic to criticize the leader of Israel, right? Just to say that is anti-Semitic. And then the struggle then, are you Jewish enough? And you know, all of what you just, okay, so why did you just make that face?
No, I mean, like, this is the story of my life, and I imagine many people here have experienced this. You know, depending on who you ask, I'm either a self-hating Jew or a genocidal Zionist. And that's the reality of this debate right now. And I know it's true for many friends in the Arab and Muslim American and other communities right now too, where if you're getting it from both sides, you're not good enough from both sides. It tells you that maybe you're exactly where you should be. Because the loudest, most extreme voices, particularly I would say post-October 7th, have been working overtime to pit our communities against one another. And particularly what we're seeing in the Jewish community right now is a very deliberate effort by extreme voices on the fringes on both sides to make Jews feel isolated and alone. On the right to say, hey, no one is showing up for the Jewish community, no one is there. I get a call every day from some Jewish leader who says, you know, like, where were all of our allies after October 7th? And I tell them about the conversations I had. When I talked to Maya in the days after October 7th, I think about the Black civil rights leaders who called me October 8th. And it's being clear about what allyship is. It's not supporting the actions of the Israeli government, it's supporting the humanity of the Jewish and Israeli people. And at the same time, there are those on the far left who are trying to effectively marginalize and divide Jews from the very spaces and coalitions we need to be in this moment, that are actually inherent to protecting our democracy and building an inclusive society, by saying, you know, Zionists are not welcome here, or Jews are not welcome here, or conflating the Jewish community with the Israeli government, or any of the above. And so we need to be really clear-eyed that this is not accidental. It's a deliberate strategy to make Jews, and I would say Muslim Americans, Arab Americans, and many other communities that are effectively being used as pawns in these debates, to make us feel isolated and alone and keep us apart from one another, as opposed to building the very coalitions we need to advance democracy.
So on one hand, this is an idea that we just heard, you know, from hearing what you were saying, but what David was saying was, you know, the idea of training your mind to be, and what we heard from Tim was getting in the room together. But you're saying there's an active effort to keep us apart, and that this is actually creating to some degree, contributing to the extreme thinking that doesn't get people in the room. Okay, Tim, you're up. What do you think? And
Well,
what would you do about it? Because
So-
you know how to bring people together.
I mean, I would refer, so two days from now, I head to Israel for a week, have a similar trip at the end of June to do exactly this in Jerusalem, to bring Muslim, Christian, Jewish, actually Druze leaders together, religious leaders, not political leaders, to just talk and build some appreciation. Quickly, a phrase that I use for myself and try to introduce to others is your question about like what do we do about the extremes is you're not going to out-scream a screamer. And if you do, then you also have lost probably some credibility yourself. So the phrase I use is to be courageously calm or courageously quiet at times. There is an impulse even, especially for journalists. I've got to get my thing in like 5 minutes ago. So I don't have time to like find the nuanced, most precise voice. I've got to, and generally journalists, Rolodexes are populated, by the way, with the loudest voice on polls, because that's what I do is I get the tit, I get the tat, and I put them together, and then I bundle it. But to even build a Rolodex around courageously calm voices / groups increasingly, but ironically, like, how many of you would be able to tell me who the most courageously calm member of the Republican House of Representatives is right now? Like, immediately you would think of there's 7 people that are on the tip of your tongue that are not that you don't like, but could you tell me who you do like, or at least are open to listening to? Same clearly for Democrats. We know about 6 voices that are on tour right now that everybody knows. Are they courageously calm? Probably not.
Well, I think you're speaking to something that actually is really kind of about how we tick. I mean, do we hear those who are calm? Are we not in a time when the shouter is the one that's most heard? Are we not also in a time when we are vigilant about where the attacks are coming from and not vigilant about where the love is coming from? Maya.
I really appreciate that framing, right? Courageously calm. I try to be calm all the time, not because I am naturally calm, but because I have always approached this work as feeling that I don't have the privilege of not being effective. So if I'm shouting, I agree, I'm going to lose you. But I feel an urgent need to introduce 2 things we haven't noted yet. One ties to what you were talking about, Tim, which is that where are they coming from as opposed to what they're saying, right? And part of where that person is, who I may absolutely disagree with, is coming from a place of fear. So the effectiveness of making us afraid of the other has been pretty significant. We do a great deal of work at my organization on the issue of hate crimes. We've seen a trajectory from the 2015 presidential election on that has gone straight up, breaking records year after year against every single community. So I can't tell you, oh, hate crimes against this community have gone down. Nope, it's straight up. So the fear piece of it has worked, and I think when you talk about walls going up and shutting down, I keep talking about the conflation, please don't conflate, but let's be honest, America has a problem with anti-Muslim bigotry. The Department of Justice had to argue a case in 2010 in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. They submitted a brief saying Islam is a religion that's worthy of protection, like it's not a cult. That's pretty extraordinary. I'm not sure today's DOJ would do that, but let's just say 2010 that had to happen. A couple of days ago, we had a person in Texas grab a microphone at a community event, not because, I don't know what her motivation is, other than, may I dare suggest, it's going to be a very effective fundraiser for her congressional campaign. And the target was the American Muslim community. So there is that piece of it that's very much in play, and the fear factor is the way that you get to doing that. But the second point is when we talk about people feeling sort of taking extreme positions or not. I would be, I'm uncomfortable not noting this is a particularly unusual time for us in terms of our democracy and the challenges we're facing, but it is also an unusual time for what is happening in the region. I so appreciate when Amy says October 6th. And she said it today, sitting right next to me. I didn't have to say October 6th, you did. Meaning, there is an issue before October 7th that existed, and the people that have been suffering from disposition and occupation, and what is a credibly unfolding genocide today that the United States is actively engaged in. So when we talk about, because I feel very protective of these students, when we talk about people taking extreme positions or not, yes, I want to be calm, and yes, there are chants I don't chant, period. But yes, there are things I don't say. But the point is, please give the context and the deference and the grace for what you're hearing, and ask the question, why are you saying that? Because part of what I keep coming back to is the language lands differently for us, but Congress is only holding hearings on one of the language sets. Your guidance for reporting tends to emphasize one of the guidance sets. So that's the piece of it that I think we have to keep thinking about.
So we're out of time, and let me just simply say, in all the Abrahamic faiths, and including Christianity in all its forms, and in all the other major religions, and among most human beings, there is a prayer for peace, really. And so let us hope our prayers are answered soon. Thank you, Amy and Maya and Tim and David, for being here today. Thank you.